He walked onto the stage with the same calm intensity that defines his presence in every arena he steps into. Dressed sharp but understated, he carried that familiar mix of confidence and unpredictability. The crowd, already electric with anticipation, fell into a hush as he leaned into the microphone. The topic at hand was heavy: the future of artificial intelligence and humanity's role in shaping it. The moment had all the makings of a friendly philosophical exchange, but what unfolded was anything but gentle. Across from him sat someone known for his tranquil wisdom, a beloved figure who often speaks about the soul of humanity, the beauty of imperfection, and the mystery of existence. He began with a soft, almost poetic reflection, hinting at the idea that perhaps machines could never truly understand the human spirit. His words carried weight, no doubt, and the audience was visibly moved. For a second, it felt like he had set the tone, guiding the conversation into deep, reflective waters. But then, everything shifted. With barely a change in expression, the speaker responded. Not with sentiment, not with agreement. He came armed with facts, numbers, and precision. There was no malice in his tone, but it was clear. He wasn't here to indulge dreamy thinking. He interrupted the reverie like a cold wind. "We don't have time for metaphors," he said flatly. In that one sentence, the temperature in the room dropped. Everyone sat a little straighter. He began laying out the math, the code, the neural networks. He described the trajectory of machine learning with such clarity, it felt less like prediction and more like prophecy. When the other tried to interrupt, tried to bring it back to the essence of the soul, he overrode the sentiment with a single, brutal truth. Emotions don't scale. Empathy doesn't program itself. Consciousness, if it ever arrives in machines, won't look like ours, and wishing otherwise won't change a damn thing. The intensity of his gaze never broke. He wasn't there to spar. He was there to correct. He challenged the very foundation of the romantic idea that humanity's uniqueness is some kind of safeguard. "The universe doesn't owe us a happy ending," he said. And for a moment, it felt like the entire audience forgot to breathe. It wasn't about ego. It was about urgency. The world is accelerating, technology evolving faster than regulation, faster than ethics, faster than most people can even comprehend. And here was someone talking about the soul. No disrespect, but that kind of talk in his mind is how you lose the race, how you sleepwalk into irrelevance. He laid it out clearly. If machines surpass us in intelligence, they won't ask for permission. They won't pause for reflection. They'll act, and we'd better be ready. There was something surgical about how he dismantled the argument. No raised voice, no grandstanding, just raw, unflinching logic. He didn't mock the other speaker, didn't laugh or belittle, but he didn't bend either. He simply refused to let sentimentality override survival instinct, and in doing so, he drew a hard line between possibility and delusion. The camera panned across the crowd. Faces were stunned, not angry, just processing. Because deep down, everyone knows when truth hits the table. And this wasn't fiction. This was a warning disguised as a conversation. He wasn't there to entertain or inspire. He was there to recalibrate. In that moment, the contrast between the two men became stark. One spoke with his heart, the other with the cold precision of someone who's seen the numbers and didn't like what he saw. And while both voices had value, only one left the room shaken. Not because of who said it, but because of what was said, and how undeniably right it sounded. For years, his reputation had been solid as a rock, unshakable, serene, almost otherworldly. Whether on screen or in interviews, he always carried an aura of calm that made people feel safe, understood, and inspired. His words were often poetic, laced with a sense of deep reflection. People didn't just listen to him, they leaned in, searching for wisdom. So when the discussion began, the audience naturally expected him to do what he always does: anchor the conversation in humanity, in philosophy, in soul. And he did. He spoke about empathy. He spoke about the human condition. He painted a picture of coexistence, man and machine not as rivals, but as companions. It was thoughtful, soft, and hopeful. His voice was steady, almost meditative, and for a while the entire room floated with him. You could see it in their eyes. People were comforted by his vision of the future, a future not ruled by fear or power, but by balance. But then something shifted. The person across from him didn't follow that current. Instead of meeting hope with more hope, he responded with a jarring dose of reality. He stripped away the poetry, replacing it with raw logic, brutal facts, and an unflinching view of the future. The conversation, which had started like a dance, suddenly became something else entirely, a confrontation between feeling and fact, between idealism and hard data. That's when something rare happened. He paused, not for effect, but because he didn't have an immediate answer. For a brief second, the silence said more than words ever could. He looked as if someone had opened a door he hadn't expected to find in this conversation. Not because the topic was unfamiliar, but because of how starkly it was presented. He blinked, swallowed slightly, adjusted his posture. These were subtle movements, but in a man known for stillness, they spoke volumes. The words aimed at him hadn't been cruel or loud, but they had been precise. They had cut through the soft fog of optimism with a scalpel of urgency. And in that moment, something in him looked uncertain. Not defeated, not broken, but undeniably rattled. The same person who'd once delivered profound reflections on death, love, and time now found himself on the receiving end of a worldview so cold, so calculated, that it threatened to upend everything he believed about our place in the future. Tried to respond. He reached for something, an idea, a metaphor, a comeback, but it didn't quite land. The words were there, but the weight had shifted. You could sense it. The audience could sense it. That feeling he usually brought into a room, the unspoken trust that he was a lighthouse in the storm, was flickering. People noticed. Social media caught it immediately. Clips began circulating, focusing on that exact moment. The pause, the expression, the subtle realization that maybe the conversation wasn't going to end the way it began. For someone who had long been seen as untouchable, that single moment of hesitation was both shocking and strangely humanizing. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not with aggression, but with relentless logic. He had always existed in a space where people welcomed his reflections, where deep thoughts were not only allowed but celebrated. And yet here he was, confronted by a worldview that saw beauty as a distraction and sentiment as a liability. It wasn't that he was disrespected. It was that he was outmaneuvered intellectually and emotionally in a way that left no room for his usual rhythm. And to his credit, he didn't lash out. He didn't grow defensive or try to change the subject. He listened. He processed. But even in that grace, it was clear. The ground had shifted beneath his feet. The conversation had entered territory he couldn't navigate with intuition alone. The silent gasp in the room wasn't because he failed, it was because he faltered. Just for a moment. But for someone like him, that moment was all it took to show the world something they hadn't seen before. For the first time, he looked like a man who didn't have all the answers. And that was the room fell quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from boredom or disinterest. It was the kind of silence that crackles, an electric, suspended tension where everyone knows they've just witnessed something they weren't expecting. No one clapped. No one even moved at first. It was like time had paused just long enough for reality to sink in. And then it began, the ripple effect that would spread far beyond the confines of the studio walls. It started in the audience. A few wide-eyed glances, murmurs exchanged between people who, moments before, were smiling at the calm, thoughtful energy of the discussion. Now they looked stunned. One person mouthed, "Did that just happen?" Another leaned forward as if physically needing to get closer to make sense of it. It wasn't the response itself that caused the shift. It was the force behind it. The pie. Clarity, the unfiltered, unapologetic truth of it, and the way it dropped into the conversation like a bolt of lightning. Then came the first tweets, One after another, people online reacted in real time. Clips surfaced within minutes, taken from audience phones, slightly shaky, a little off-center, but capturing every second of the moment. They spread like wildfire. That face when reality hits. Silence says more than words. I've never seen him like that before. Hashtags started trending. Not just the names involved, but deeper topics. AI ethics, existential risk, the illusion of safety. The moment had touched a nerve, and the internet was wide awake. Memes emerged with terrifying speed. Side-by-sides of his usual composed demeanor contrasted with the look on his face in that now famous pause. Text overlays turned into punchlines, into questions, into commentary. But it wasn't all jokes. Far from it. Some people were angry, furious, that a man so admired, so grounded, had been undercut like that. Others were exhilarated, thrilled to see the sheen of invincibility fade, if only for a second. Then the think pieces began. Writers, philosophers, tech experts, all weighing in. Articles titled, "When Idealism Meets the Inevitable," "The Night the Tables Turned," and "The Future Doesn't Wait for Feelings" were published within hours. Everyone had an opinion. Some defended the moment as necessary, a brutal but honest reflection of where the world is headed. Others mourned what they saw as the loss of something sacred, the idea that emotion could still guide innovation. Talk shows picked it up next. Hosts debated whether it was a fair exchange or an ambush masked as dialogue. One panelist said, "It's like watching two different worlds collide, one running on heart, the other on code." Another responded, "And guess which one's winning?" That tension, that clash of realities, became the story. But underneath all the commentary, there was something deeper. People weren't just reacting to what was said. They were reacting to the shift it represented. A shift in tone, in tempo, in belief. The world had been coasting on the idea that compassion and innovation could walk hand in hand forever. And then, in one unscripted, unguarded moment, that illusion was called into question, not by a shout, but by a surgical dismantling of comfortable thoughts. Even days later, it lingered. Clips continued circulating. New edits, remixes, slow-motion breakdowns of facial expressions and body language. Analysts paused at frame 47 to highlight the exact millisecond the message landed. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to dissecting the psychology of the exchange. It became more than a viral moment. It became a cultural checkpoint because everyone felt it. Whether they agreed or not, they recognized the weight of it. The line had been drawn in real time, on live television, in front of millions. Not a debate, not a meltdown, not even an argument. Just one worldview cracking slightly under the pressure of another. And the world watched, not just with fascination, but with a strange sense of awakening. Something had changed, and nobody could unsee it. It was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic music. It wasn't loud or flashy. In fact, it was almost eerily calm, controlled to the point of discomfort. But everyone in the room, and eventually the world, knew exactly what had happened. The dynamic shifted. One voice didn't just dominate the conversation, it took control of the entire space, the tone, the narrative. With every word, with every pause, it became clear. There was no sharing of the stage anymore. He didn't raise his voice. There were no sweeping hand gestures, no need to perform for the cameras. He spoke like someone who didn't need to convince anyone of anything. He already knew the truth and delivered it as if it were undeniable. What made it so compelling wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. The kind that comes from deep, relentless thought and the kind of preparation that leaves no cracks to poke through. That level of confidence doesn't just appear, it's forged over time. And when it hits the room, it commands attention without having to ask for it. The conversation had started out balanced, a respectful exchange between two perspectives. One was grounded in experience, idealism, a humanistic lens on technology and progress. It offered comfort, a kind of philosophical buffer against the cold realities of advancement. The other side didn't oppose that comfort, It simply didn't acknowledge it as relevant. When faced with sentiment, it responded with numbers. When met with hope, it answered with probability. And when asked for balance, it made a case for urgency. What made the shift so striking was how quickly the audience stopped seeing the discussion as two equals. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began leaning more toward one side of the conversation, not because it was more poetic or moving, but because it felt immovable, like gravity. You could feel the mental realignment happening in real time. People were no longer watching a dialogue, they were absorbing a lesson. One speaker was theorizing about the future, while the other was defining it. Even the host, who had started with an air of playful moderation, faded into the background. There was no longer a need to keep the discussion in check. There was only one direction the energy was flowing. Control had been seized without force, and everyone followed because they recognized the shift in weight. The power in the room had moved. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet authority of someone who knew their vision was already unfolding, whether others agreed or not. The effect went far beyond the studio. Online, people replayed clips, not just for what was said, but for how it was said. Analysts noticed the rhythm, the tempo, the body language, the slight tilt of the head, the measured tone, the unwavering gaze. It was surgical. People don't remember most of what gets said in public conversations. They remember how someone made them feel, and in this case, the feeling was unmistakable. One voice was in control, and the rest of the world had no choice but to catch up. It wasn't dominance for the sake of dominance. It wasn't about winning a debate. It was about establishing clarity in a space usually clouded by abstractions. When faced with hypotheticals, he drew a straight line. When faced with emotion, he responded with logic so tight it left no room for rebuttal. The room didn't erupt in applause because they weren't sure whether they were allowed to clap, or if they even wanted to. They were still processing what had just happened. What stood out most was the way people responded after the fact. In conversations afterward, whether in comment sections, newsrooms, or living rooms, the consensus was the same. That wasn't just someone offering a take, that was someone taking the lead. In a world where everyone's shouting to be heard, he spoke with a kind of restraint that silenced the noise. He didn't demand attention, he made it irrelevant to look anywhere else. That kind of presence can't be manufactured. It can't be faked. When someone walks into a room with a complete command of their ideas, backed by experience and sharpened by purpose, the world listens, not because it has to, but because it knows it should. And in that moment, that's exactly what happened. One voice took the room, the air, the moment, and didn't give it back. In the aftermath of that moment, the world didn't return to normal right away. Something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the broader conversation about power, influence, and the way we navigate the future. The event itself was brief, a segment in a longer discussion, but its impact extended far beyond the bounds of television. What played out on that stage became a symbol, a catalyst, a mirror held up to how we process truth in an age of noise. What struck people most wasn't the drama, it was the precision, the clarity, the way one voice carved through the usual fog of half-baked ideas and empty optimism, forcing everyone to recalibrate their understanding. No shouting, no insults, just a commanding presence backed by knowledge, vision, and a level of conviction rarely seen in public discourse. It was the kind of moment that exposes the difference between those who speculate and those who act, between those who feel and those who know, between comfort and confrontation. That quiet authority didn't just silence a room, it shifted the public tone. Online, the debate evolved. People weren't just reacting to what happened, they were rethinking their stance on everything from AI ethics to philosophical idealism. Comment threads turned into forums, memes turned into conversations. Even those who didn't agree couldn't ignore it, because that kind of presence doesn't invite silence, it demands response. But perhaps the most important outcome wasn't the shock or the viral wave. It was the reminder that some voices carry a gravity beyond popularity or likability. In a world where charisma often overshadows substance, this moment proved that sometimes sheer clarity is enough to take command. Sometimes it's not about being the loudest or the most liked, it's about being undeniable. And undeniable is exactly what that moment was. For a few minutes, live on camera, millions of people watched a worldview be challenged, a legend be shaken, and a narrative be taken over. Not with cruelty, not with chaos, but with calm, calculated control, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be remembered. In the end, it wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a lesson in presence, in truth, in what happens when preparation meets the spotlight and refuses to blink. Moments like that don't fade, they echo. They stay in people's minds. And whether you saw it as disruption or revelation, one thing was clear. Power, when it's real, doesn't need to ask permission. It simply arrives, takes the